Jung's Analytical Psychology, Part 8, The Archetypes. First part, Personality Psychology, Dr. Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Archetypes represent possibilities for thought and action. They're wired deep in our collective unconscious. In fact, they are the structural components of the collective unconscious. If you remember my little lousy drawing of Jung's model, these were the projections of psychic energy within the collective unconscious. Some of them also permeate into the personal unconscious and get surrounded by complexes. And these complexes may flavor an archetype. So, for example, if you have a strong God archetype and you're a very religious person, you most likely have a complex about your religion and your views of God that surround your God archetype. Now, the archetypes also contain much emotional content. It's where a lot of our triggers for emotions and other things that we feel are at. According to Jung, they're permanent deposits of psychic energy in the mind based on experiences that have been repeated for generations and generations. My view on these would be that they're the successful adaptations of generations that lead us to think, behave, and feel in certain systematic ways. If you've been in a perception class, you may have learned about perception and the notion of feature detectors, where you see something that's like a template or something and it gives you a cue to interpret a object. Same thing with archetypes. You see something and that archetype fits in with that object that you're observing, and it kind of gives you a guide for action. You're kind of geared already for action. You don't have to learn every single thing because the archetypes guide our behavior. Well, they sound like pretty cool things, but how do we know about archetypes? Well, according to Jung, archetypes penetrate into our conscious mind as myths and symbols. In fact, this is, I think, the interesting and fun part of discussing Jungian theory, period, is the archetypes. Jung says we can allude to these latent archetypes by looking at how they affect our behavior. Which for a trait guy isn't a big leap, since I also view traits as latent structures in your head that cause you to behave in a certain way, but we'll get to that later. So we know about archetypes because of myths and symbols, and a large part of Jung's work and a large part of the work he inspired has to do with looking at myths and symbols and those types of things. In fact, symbols may be the outward expression of some kind of archetype. Here is a picture of George killing the dragon, a classic archetype for heroism, defeating evil, stuff like that. Symbols may also represent some kind of unsatisfied impulse someone has, which you could also call drive or motivation, that you're questing for something. You might look at a symbol like a flag and say that that is a symbol of your country, and in turn it represents your desire for your country to be the best it can be. Symbols can, and I'm giving you, like I said, a really simplistic view of this, symbols that represent some kind of long-term goal, some kind of long-term quest for our race as humans. Now, Jung uses the term race, and it's probably a bad translation, but I'll use it in the same way. Not to talk about any type of ethnicity, but to talk about the human race, all of us. So this might be some kind of future goal, striving for a better, more perfect world where everyone is happy and everyone is treated well and things like that. It might be a quest to explore and maybe move our civilization into space and onto other planets. Anything like that. Kind of these grand things. Well, you can identify tons of archetypes. Here is a list of some of that guy Jung's major archetypes. And I'll talk about some of these in more detail. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is just something I spun off the top of my head from my Jung reading. So we have the Earth Mother, a wise woman who knows all that you can go to for help and assistance. Those of you that grew up Disney, if you're going to look at that, you may have I just blanked on it, Mother Willow tree from Pocahontas would be a wise earth natural mother. Lots of examples of that in many stories and myths. The wise old man, the old man who can give you good counsel. The warrior who's going to come and save the day and defeat the enemy. The hero who's going to again conquer all but for your side and right and wrong. Now, as I'm going through these, you can see that you can get blends of all of these archetypes. Like you can get a warrior hero and things like that. And I'll give you some even more specific archetypes as we go through. Archetypes can also be manifested in things beyond characters and individuals. Birth is a great archetype. And we still talk about the birth of an idea. Death is another great mystery we all try to figure out. And there are many ancient stories and lores about what happens when one dies. Rebirth is a major archetype. The Christians do not have a corner on the resurrection market. There are many religions and cultures that have rebirth as a major archetype. Native American culture has many rebirth myths that revolve around crop cycles. The powerful person who's going to come and save the day again or exert power over you in some way. It could be good or bad. Magic. We all like to think there's magic. We like to hope that magically things will happen that will make things better for us. And we always worry about the evil curses. God. We've already talked about God as a predisposition or archetype. Unity. And then our last one is a character, the maiden, the virginal woman. And again, there's archetypal mysteries with virginity. Well, let's look at a couple of specific sets of archetypes. And I have, since I've been a little kid, been fascinated with the Arthurian legends. Here is an old tile of Arthur Rex, King Arthur. King Arthur is a major Western European myth coming out of the Dark Ages and being permutated through many different ways, many different stories. Many different cultures have Arthurian myths. Joseph Campbell, one of the leading American Jungian scholars, wrote a book about the Arthurian legends and tracing them back, and he traces them all the way back to ancient India. I have a definite preference for Thomas Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur, which is kind of the classic modern version of it, but it isn't the only single version by any means. My favorite movie version of the Arthurian legends is Excalibur. It's a little bit dated, it's a little bit 80s, but it gets all the really good stuff in there, and it gets at the archetypal things. You have Arthur, the king. He's powerful. He's wise a lot of the time. He's a warrior. And he's a hero. He combines some of the best archetypes. We also have his main mentor, Merlin. Merlin lives backwards in time according to some Arthurian legends, which means he knows what's going to always happen next. Arthur relies on Merlin for magic to help him and to guide him, to teach him. Arthur was born because Merlin used his magic to turn Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, into the form of his enemy, because basically he had the hots for his enemy's wife. His enemy is off fighting. He comes back to his enemy's castle looking just like him and seduces his opponent's wife, who he begats Arthur with. Later, his opponent dies, and Uther ends up marrying the woman, and she has other individuals in this that we'll talk about in a bit. But Merlin can use his magic for good things or bad things, and he usually laments the bad stuff. He's one of the last of the Druid magicians, and according to some Arthurian legends, he's kind of pushed out of importance because of the growing importance of Christianity. We have two characters who are very archetypal in the beginning, and then they change. The left, we have Lancelot with his gleaming armor. Lancelot starts off as the perfect knight. He befriends Arthur. He's Arthur's champion. Then we have, to his right, Queen Guinevere, Arthur's wife, who, well, Lancelot eventually fools around with. And then they have the archetype of betrayal, because they have betrayed their liege lord Arthur in the most heinous way possible by having a tempestuous affair. Messes up a lot of stuff for Arthur and Camelot. Here we have Arthur's sister Morgana, actually stepsister. And she seduces Arthur and has a son with him named Mordred. This violates one of the major human taboos, the incest taboo. Now, she magically puts a spell on Arthur, so you can't give Arthur too much of a hard time for that one. But then you get the great thing between father and son, as Mordred wants to displace Arthur as king and tries his whole life to do that, and turns into Arthur's main opponent. The Round Table in the Arthurian legends represents unity. There's no head, there's no beginning, there's no end. According to Arthurian legend, all are equal around the table, no matter how high of a prince or a king you are. and many of Arthur's knights, by legends, were kings and princes from other places that decided that they'd throw in with Arthur and come to Camelot and become part of the Round Table. The Maiden of the Lake. She's going to be the last Arthurian archetype I talk about. Now, depending on the version, she brings Excalibur to Arthur out of the lake, and he goes forth with his weapon and unifies England. Or in other versions of the tale, Arthur misuses Excalibur and breaks it, and in anger throws it into the water, and the Lady of the Lake magically brings a complete and whole Excalibur to Arthur so he could carry on his quest for good. So, the Arthurian legends have always been something I've been attracted to because I love medieval history, Dark Ages history, and I think they're just pretty cool stories. They get into a lot of major archetypes. But there are more modern stories that get at Jungian archetypes, and they do so in some interesting ways. And let me take a minute and talk to you about Jungian archetypes within the context of something you may know a little bit about, love it or hate it, Star Wars. And believe it or not, Star Wars, at least the first three, which to me are episodes 4, 5, and 6, were highly influenced by Joseph Campbell, as I've already mentioned, America's foremost Jungian scholar. Now, Joseph Campbell developed something he called the hero's journey, which talks about how heroes through history have gone on quest. And there are many common features to these quests, being given a talisman or a weapon, being given good advice. Then the mentor always goes away in some way. These are all key things in Star Wars. Now, I was much younger in 1978 when Star Wars first came out. I had graduated high school already. I remember going to the theater and seeing Star Wars for the first time. Seeing Star Wars special effects, no big deal now. But in 1978, I just remember almost falling off of my seat onto the floor as Princess Leia and her little ship is being chased by that massive Star Destroyer that just takes over the screen. I was kind of hooked. I've loved some of the movies because of my love for some of the movies. I've hated others. But I'm extremely fascinated with 4, 5, and 6 because Campbell was around for the first couple of them and exerted great influence on George Lucas in terms of how he created the stories, the themes he put there. I'm going to show you a short video clip featuring Joseph Campbell discussing his views of myth. This is from a public broadcasting show that interviewed Campbell about his interest in work before he died. It's a fascinating set of videos. But I'm going to show you just a couple of minute clip about Star Wars specifically. Hang on, let me get it going. Here we go.
Does a movie like Star Wars fill some of that need for the spiritual adventure for the hero?
Oh, perfect. It does the cycle perfectly. It's not simple morality play. It has to do with the powers of life and their inflection through the action of man. One of the wonderful things I think about this adventure into space is that the narrator, the artist, the one thinking up the story, is in a field that is not covered by our own knowledges.
Do you, when you look at something like Star Wars, recognize some of the themes of the hero throughout mythology?
Well, I think that George Lucas was using standard mythological figures. The old man as the advisor, well, specifically, what he made me think of is the Japanese sword master.
Remember, a Jedi can feel the Force flowing through him.
I've known some of those people, and this man has a bit their character.
Well, there's something mythological, too, isn't there, in the sense that the hero is helped by this stranger who shows up and gives him some instrument, a sword or a sheaf of life.
But he gives him not only a physical instrument, but a psychological commitment and a psychological center.
This time, let go your conscious self and act on instinct.
Well, he had him exercising with that strange weapon, and then pulled the mask over. That's real Japanese stuff.
When I took our two sons to see it, they did the same thing the audience did at that moment when the voice of Ben Kenobi says to Luke Skywalker in the climactic moment,
Use the Force, Luke. Let go, Luke.
the audience broke out into
They did.
elation, to
Well, you
applause.
see, this thing communicates. It is in a language that is talking to young people today, and that's marvelous.
And that naturally was done well over 40 years ago, and Star Wars still speaks to many people today, as we've just finished and saw the last episode move to cable TV. So let's take a brief look at some of the classic Star Wars characters in terms of their archetypal qualities. So here we have Luke. Here we have the young Luke, the farm boy who quests for adventure, being turned into the hero. He has Obi-Wan Kenobi as his mentor. He gives him his father's lightsaber and says that he needs to go help, sets him up for doing it, and then before his journey is done, he has that epic fight with Vader on the Death Star, and before Vader can do anything to him, he becomes part of the Force. Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, who starts off as a warrior, pirate, smuggler. You guys have seen the movie. By the end of the series, he goes in and out of being a general, a leader, all reluctant. The last couple of episodes in the Star Wars series, he goes back to just wanting to fly around in the Millennium Falcon and do deals and stuff like that. Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia, is to me the ultimate Earth Mother character in any movie. She is a very wise, intelligent woman. She plays that all the way through the series, even as she morphs into a leader and general of the cause, but she's still a princess. I remember seeing the one movie where Jabba the Hutt dresses her in the steel bikini thing, and finding that kind of offensive because, hey, you don't dress an Earth Mother up in a steel bikini. And Carrie Fisher had to live around that role for the rest of her life, and it caused her some problems. I'll see if I can add a Just for Fun slide. There's an old Saturday Night Live sketch where she tries to play counter to Princess Leia just on purpose. But yeah, she's the consummate wise Earth Mother. My favorite Star Wars character of all time, Yoda, who sounds slightly like Joseph Campbell to me. Just a stylized Joseph Campbell voice. Yoda is small but extremely powerful. He also manifests some of the archetypal qualities of the comic jokester, especially with his first encounters with Luke, where he's trying to guide and mentor him and show him not to look at the obvious and cliche. He's a lot packed into a small 900-year-old package. He's a warrior, he's a mentor, he's a leader. He talks about the importance of the unity of the Force and all those kinds of things. A lot of us now have the question, what is the archetypal role of the child? Is the child Yoda, or is it just of Yoda's species? We've got to find that out yet from The Mandalorian. But I'm still a little bit of a Star Wars geek and couldn't get by without throwing in a child. I'm still waiting to find a child stuffed animal for my little collection here. After episodes 4, 5, and 6, we get the introduction of Jar Jar Binks, who represents initially the archetypal character of the fool, the idiot, the kind of naive bumpkin. Some people consider him one of the most annoying of all of the Jungian archetypes in the Star Wars series. To me, it's only fitting that he eventually becomes a politician in the later series, because I think it only reflects certain aspects of today's society, and you can project whatever you want to on those. Now, Star Wars itself isn't the best science fiction story ever. It's cheesy. It was inspired by the old Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon serials of the 1930s or 40s that used to be on morning television, being approximately the same age as George Lucas. I used to love those things as a kid. I can also see things that he doesn't talk about as being influences. When I was growing up, I used to watch all of the Errol Flynn swashbuckler movies and all of those. I was just very much into the pirate movies and Errol Flynn playing pirates, and he played Don Juan. He played all kinds of characters with swords and those kinds of things. Probably ultimately Robin Hood, which is another major archetype. Take from the rich, give to the poor kind of character. So what Star Wars to me does is not being the super greatest movie in the world, but what it does, because it's so carefully engineered to pull our archetypal strings, it gets to us, and we like it. Now, sometimes after Campbell passed and Lucas was kind of free-floating without another Joe Campbell to help him, he kind of went astray sometimes, and sometimes the archetypes in the later movies to me look just like cliches. But think about any great movie, any book, work of art, story, current or mythological, the stories get to us because they hit our unconscious archetypes. And one of the reasons that we know that those archetypes are there, or at least the Jungians do, is how they've been projected into our culture. And you know from pop culture that, you know, Star Wars in itself is a subculture of our society. There are some people who live a Star Wars lifestyle. I have my brother-in-law has I slightly misspoke, employee who's a total Star Wars geek. He's got rooms and rooms of Star Wars stuff. He's got, storage areas full of Star Wars stuff. He got messed up financially. And what did he do? Did he sell the Star Wars stuff? No, he lost his house, kept the Star Wars stuff. That's how powerful these things can be to some people. Of course, sometimes I think that might be very non-adaptive, but that's a whole nother story. So those are how archetypes work, what they may represent. But there are some other important archetypes that we use to attempt to figure out the world. And we'll come back with a second video lecture covering things like the animus, the shadow, and the persona. But this is the end of part 1 of our journey into archetypes. May the Force be with you. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.